Welcome to Hollybuzz, where today we step into one of the most unsettling and atmospheric survival horror films of recent years, Cold Skin. This is not a movie that rushes into fear or relies on cheap jump scares. Instead, it slowly drags the viewer into isolation, loneliness, and psychological terror. From the very first moments, the film establishes a haunting mood, placing us on a remote island at the edge of the world, far from civilization, law, or comfort. The sound of crashing waves, the endless darkness of the night, and the constant presence of cold become characters in themselves. Cold Skin immediately makes it clear that this is a story about endurance, not just of the body, but of the mind and soul. Every frame feels damp, heavy, and suffocating, as if the island itself is watching and waiting for something to break. Released in 2017, Cold Skin arrived with modest expectations, but quickly gained attention for its unique blend of monster horror, psychological drama, and philosophical undertones. Directed by Xavier Gens, the film carries a gritty and raw visual style that perfectly matches its bleak narrative. On IMDb, the movie holds a rating of around 6.0, reflecting mixed but curious reactions, while Rotten Tomatoes shows a divided response between critics and audiences who found the film disturbing yet thought-provoking. Made on a relatively limited budget, Cold Skin relies far more on atmosphere, practical effects, and performances than on large-scale spectacle. At the box office, it never aimed to be a commercial blockbuster, but it found its audience among viewers who appreciate slow-burn horror and unconventional storytelling. The story begins with a nameless young man, played by David Oakes, arriving on the island to take over the post of a weather observer. His expectations of solitude quickly turn into confusion when he discovers that the previous observer is missing, and the island is far from empty. He soon meets Gruner, the lighthouse keeper, portrayed by Ray Stevenson, a hardened and mysterious man who seems permanently scarred by the place. Gruner's rough behavior, guarded expressions, and strange routines immediately suggest that survival on this island demands more than physical strength. It demands emotional numbness. As night falls for the first time, the film shifts gears, revealing the island's horrifying secret. Creatures emerge from the sea to attack, relentless and savage, turning darkness into a battlefield. What makes Cold Skin stand out is how it treats its monsters. They are terrifying, yes, but they are not presented as mindless beasts. Their design is disturbing yet strangely human, forcing the viewer to question their role in the story. The nightly attacks become repetitive, brutal rituals, slowly stripping away the protagonist's sense of reality. Fear transforms into routine, and routine transforms into obsession. Gruner appears almost addicted to the violence, while the young observer struggles to understand the purpose behind this endless conflict. The film quietly builds tension, allowing dread to settle in rather than explode, making every night feel heavier than the last. By the time the first phase of the story settles in, Cold Skin has already done something rare. It has trapped the audience inside the same psychological cage as its characters. Isolation becomes unbearable, trust becomes fragile, and survival begins to demand moral compromises. The island no longer feels like a location, it feels like a curse, and as the sea keeps calling and the darkness keeps returning, the film prepares to dive deeper into themes far more disturbing than simple monster horror. And as the story moves deeper into the endless cycle of night and violence, Cold Skin begins to peel away its surface horror and reveal something far more disturbing underneath. The attacks from the sea are no longer shocking. They are expected, routine, almost mechanical. This repetition is intentional, forcing the audience to feel the same exhaustion and numbness that consumes the characters. Ray Stevenson's Gruner becomes increasingly unsettling to watch, not because of what he fears, but because of what he accepts. His hatred toward the creatures feels absolute, yet hollow, driven more by years of isolation than any real sense of justice. He no longer fights to survive. He fights because fighting is all he knows. The young weather observer, on the other hand, begins to change in a quieter, more tragic way. Fear gives way to curiosity, and curiosity slowly transforms into empathy. His interactions with the captured sea creature introduce one of the film's most controversial and uncomfortable elements, challenging the audience to reconsider everything they believed about the monsters. These moments are deliberately disturbing, not meant to shock, but to unsettle moral certainty. The film refuses to offer clear answers, instead asking whether understanding the enemy is an act of humanity or a betrayal of survival instincts. This shift in perspective becomes the emotional core of Cold Skin, turning it into a story about perception rather than pure conflict. Visually, the film grows colder and more oppressive as it progresses. The lighthouse, once a symbol of protection, becomes a prison lit by fire and shadow. The sea, initially portrayed as a source source of terror, begins to feel strangely honest compared to the cruelty on land. The sound design plays a crucial role here. Silence is used as a weapon, broken only by wind, waves, and distant screams. Every night feels longer. Every dawn feels emptier, reinforcing the idea that escape is not just impossible, but meaningless. Director Xavier Gens allows these moments to breathe, trusting atmosphere over explanation, and it's this restraint that gives the film its haunting power. As the narrative approaches its conclusion, Cold Skin abandons traditional horror structure entirely. There is no triumphant final battle, no sense of victory or closure. Instead, the film offers a bleak reflection on power, domination, and the consequences of dehumanization. The lines between human and monster blur beyond recognition, leaving the viewer unsettled long after the final frame. The ending is quiet, almost indifferent, suggesting that the true horror was never the creatures emerging from the sea, but what isolation and fear turned humans into over time. In its final moments, Cold Skin leaves the audience with an uncomfortable truth. Survival can strip away empathy just as easily as it strips away fear. The film stands as a cold, unforgiving meditation on loneliness, violence, and moral decay, proving that the most terrifying monsters are not always born in the dark. Sometimes they are shaped by it. Through its oppressive atmosphere, unsettling performances, and refusal to offer easy answers, Cold Skin earns its place as a deeply disturbing and thought-provoking piece of survival horror. And with the final layer peeled away, Cold Skin stops functioning as a conventional film, and instead becomes an experience that lingers uncomfortably in the mind. By this stage, the island feels less like a physical location and more like a psychological state, a place where time has no meaning and morality slowly erodes. The constant exposure to fear, violence, and isolation reshapes the characters completely. Gruner is no longer portrayed as a protector or survivor. He is revealed as a man consumed by hatred, clinging to dominance as his last sense of identity. His brutality toward the sea creatures feels ritualistic, almost desperate, as if destroying them is the only way he can convince himself that his suffering has purpose. The unnamed observer reaches a point where survival alone is no longer enough. His internal conflict becomes the true climax of the film. The growing emotional connection he forms challenges everything the island has taught him about fear and power. This is where Cold Skin becomes deeply philosophical, suggesting that understanding the enemy does not weaken humanity, it exposes it. The creature is no longer a symbol of invasion, but of exploitation, and this realization hits quietly, without dramatic confrontation. The film trusts the audience to sit with this discomfort, to question whether the violence was ever justified in the first place. The visual storytelling reaches its most haunting form here. Firelight flickers against stone walls, shadows stretch unnaturally, and the sea no longer roars, it watches. The lighthouse, once a beacon of hope, now feels like a monument to madness. The repetition of nightfall reinforces the idea that escape was never part of the design. Even when moments of calm appear, they are fragile, temporary, and filled with dread. The world outside the island feels distant, almost unreal, as if civilization itself might have been a dream. The ending does not resolve conflict, it absorbs it. There is no sense of justice, no reassurance that lessons have been learned. Instead, Cold Skin closes on a haunting ambiguity that forces reflection rather than relief. The cycle continues, not because it must, but because it has been accepted. Survival carries on, stripped of heroism and meaning, leaving behind only routine and resignation. This deliberate lack of closure is what makes the film so unsettling. It refuses to comfort the viewer or explain itself. In the end, Cold Skin stands as a bleak meditation on isolation, colonial instinct, and the human need to dominate what it does not understand. It uses horror not to entertain, but to confront, pushing the audience to question who the real monsters are when fear becomes tradition and violence becomes habit. Long after the final scene fades, the film's cold atmosphere remains, proving that some stories are not meant to be escaped, only endured. And by the time Cold Skin reaches this final emotional stretch, the film feels less like a story unfolding and more like a truth being slowly exposed. The island has completed its work on the human psyche, stripping away excuses, rationalizations, and illusions of heroism. What remains is raw instinct, fragile empathy, and the quiet realization realization that violence, once normalized, becomes impossible to escape. Gruner's downfall is not framed as tragedy or justice, but as inevitability. His obsession with control consumes him entirely, revealing how isolation can rot the soul just as brutally as any physical threat. His fate feels less like punishment and more like the natural conclusion of a life built on domination and denial. The unnamed observer, now fully transformed, stands as the film's most haunting contradiction. He survives not by becoming stronger, but by becoming more aware. His understanding of the sea creatures reframes the entire narrative, forcing the audience to reinterpret every prior act of violence.
What once seemed like defense begins to resemble invasion, and what once looked like monstrosity begins to resemble resistance. This shift is subtle, unsettling, and deeply uncomfortable because it mirrors real-world patterns of fear and conquest. Cold Skin never states this outright. It allows silence and imagery to carry the weight of its message. Visually, the film embraces stillness in its closing moments. The storms subside, the attacks fade into memory, and the island returns to an eerie calm that feels more threatening than chaos ever did. The lighthouse stands tall, but hollow, no longer a symbol of guidance, but of endurance without purpose. The sea stretches endlessly, no longer roaring in anger, but breathing with quiet persistence. These images linger, reinforcing the idea that nature does not seek conflict, it only responds to intrusion. The final impression Cold Skin leaves behind is not fear, but unease. It challenges the viewer to consider how easily survival can justify cruelty, and how quickly empathy can be buried under routine violence. The film refuses to offer redemption or reassurance, instead ending on a note of cold reflection. It suggests that humanity's greatest danger is not the unknown, but the certainty with which it labels others as monsters. In doing so, Cold Skin transcends genre, becoming a grim parable about isolation, power, and the cost of losing compassion. Long after the screen fades to black, the film's atmosphere remains, heavy, damp, and quietly accusatory.
Cold Skin doesn't ask to be liked, it asks to be remembered, and in that sense, it succeeds completely, leaving behind a chilling reminder that sometimes the coldest places are not found at the edge of the world, but deep within the human mind. And with the story already stripped of comfort and certainty, Cold Skin pushes even deeper into its most unsettling idea, that coexistence was always possible, but understanding came far too late. By this stage, the island no longer feels hostile. Instead, it feels indifferent. Nature doesn't rage or threaten anymore. It simply exists, watching humanity exhaust itself through fear and dominance. The observer's realization arrives quietly, without triumph, as he begins to see the creatures not as invaders, but as beings responding to intrusion. This shift doesn't bring peace, it brings regret. The film emphasizes that awareness does not erase past violence, it only makes the weight of it heavier. Emotionally, this section of the film is carried almost entirely through silence and expression. Words become unnecessary because the truth has already settled in. The protagonist's gaze changes, no longer sharp with survival instinct, but heavy with understanding. Every movement feels slower, more deliberate, as if the body itself resists continuing the cycle. In contrast, the remnants of Gruner's worldview linger like a ghost, reminding the audience that isolation can trap people in patterns they mistake for purpose. His presence is felt even when he is gone, reinforcing how deeply hatred can embed itself into routine.
The film's use of repetition becomes especially powerful here. The familiar rhythms of nightfall, preparation, and waiting return, but without urgency. What once felt like tension now feels like tragedy. The audience realizes that the real horror of Cold Skin was never the monsters attacking from the sea, but the normalization of violence against the unknown. The creature's reduced aggression mirrors this realization, suggesting that fear thrives only as long as it is fed. When domination stops, conflict loses its meaning. Visually, the cold color palette remains, but it softens slightly, hinting at emotional thaw rather than physical warmth. The lighthouse light no longer cuts through darkness with authority. It flickers, uncertain, reflecting the fragile state of human control. The ocean, once framed as an endless threat, now carries a quiet dignity, reinforcing the film's underlying message that nature does not need permission to exist, nor justification to defend itself. By this point, Cold Skin has fully transformed into a meditation rather than a narrative. It invites the viewer to reflect on cycles of colonization, fear, and domination, without directly naming them. The horror becomes intellectual, ethical, and deeply uncomfortable. There is no sense of relief, only a somber understanding that survival without empathy is its own form of loss. And as the island settles into uneasy stillness, the film leaves the audience suspended embedded in that realization, preparing them for a conclusion that offers no escape, only truth. And as the narrative settles into its final philosophical stretch, Cold Skin begins to feel almost timeless, as if the island exists outside history and consequence. The observer's survival no longer feels like a victory. It feels like a responsibility weighted with memory. Every quiet moment carries the echo of violence that once defined this place. The absence of constant attacks does not bring peace, it brings awareness. The island's silence becomes oppressive in a new way, forcing reflection rather than reaction. The film suggests that when fear disappears, guilt often takes its place, and that guilt can be far heavier to bear. The relationship between humanity and the creatures reaches its most fragile state here. There is no formal truce, no reconciliation, only a shared understanding shaped by exhaustion. This delicate balance emphasizes one of the film's most powerful ideas. Coexistence is not built on forgiveness, but on restraint. The observer's actions become careful, almost ceremonial, as if every movement is an apology that can never be spoken aloud. This restraint contrasts sharply with earlier brutality, making the emotional shift feel earned rather than forced. Cinematically, this section is defined by stillness. Long, lingering shots allow the environment to breathe, reminding the audience that the island was never the villain. The true antagonist was isolation, combined with fear. The lighthouse, stripped of its earlier dominance, stands as a monument to endurance rather than authority. Its light no longer commands the darkness. It merely exists within it. The ocean, calm and expansive, reinforces the idea that nature neither seeks conflict nor resolution. It simply continues. The film's moral ambiguity becomes unavoidable here. Cold Skin refuses to present its message in absolutes. Instead, it leaves space for interpretation, forcing viewers to confront their own instincts toward fear and control. The observer's quiet acceptance of this ambiguity marks the final evolution of his character. He does not conquer the island. He learns to exist within it. This acceptance is not comforting, but it is honest, and honesty is the film's final weapon. By the time this chapter closes, Cold Skin has shed nearly all traces of conventional horror. What remains is a haunting reflection on humanity's relationship with the unknown. Survival has lost its urgency, replaced by the slow weight of understanding. And as the sea breathes steadily and the lighthouse stands silent, the film prepares the audience for an ending that will not shock, but resonate, an ending rooted in consequence rather than fear. And with the weight of understanding now fully settled, Cold Skin enters a phase where emotion exists beneath the surface rather than on it. The observer is no longer reacting to fear or driven by survival instinct. He is living with consequence. Every action feels measured, restrained, almost reverent, as though the island has taught him a language that can only be spoken through silence.
The absence of violence doesn't bring relief, it brings clarity. This clarity is unsettling because it forces him and the audience to acknowledge how easily brutality became routine when it was justified as defense. The creatures themselves undergo a quiet transformation in perception. They are no longer framed through attack or threat, but through presence. Their movements feel purposeful, restrained, even dignified. This shift reinforces the film's central idea that monstrosity is often a matter of perception shaped by fear. The observer's gaze no longer carries judgment, it carries recognition. In these moments, Cold Skin strips horror down to its philosophical core, asking whether violence was ever inevitable or simply chosen because it was easier than understanding. Visually, the film becomes almost hypnotic. The camera lingers on still water, fading light, and empty spaces, allowing the audience to sit with discomfort rather than escape it. The lighthouse, once loud with gunfire and flame, now feels like a hollow shell, a reminder of how power loses meaning when it has nothing left to dominate. The environment doesn't change to reward the observer's growth. It remains cold, distant, and indifferent, emphasizing that moral awakening does not guarantee comfort. The final images reinforce the film's central truth. Fear was never the enemy, misunderstanding was. The sea creatures are no longer framed as threats or mysteries, but as inhabitants defending their place in the world.
This realization arrives without dialogue, without explanation, trusting the audience to connect the dots. The lighthouse, stripped of its former authority, becomes a silent monument to misplaced dominance, a structure built to guide, but used to control. Its light no longer commands the darkness, it merely exists within it, fragile and uncertain. Emotionally, the ending leaves the viewer suspended, rather than satisfied. There is no redemption arc, no reassurance that lessons learned will change the future. Instead, Cold Skin Skin closes with acceptance of guilt, of coexistence, and of the irreversible consequences of fear-driven violence. The observer does not leave the island, nor does the island release him. Their relationship becomes one of quiet balance, shaped by restraint rather than force. This lack of closure is deliberate, reinforcing the film's refusal to simplify complex moral truths. In its final breath, Cold Skin reveals itself not as a monster film, but as a bleak parable about humanity's instinct to dominate what it does not understand. Isolation strips away social masks, leaving behind raw instinct, vulnerability, and the capacity for cruelty. Through its oppressive atmosphere, restrained performances, and philosophical depth, the film leaves a lasting imprint, one that lingers long after the screen fades to black. Cold Skin does not aim to terrify, it aims to confront, reminding us that the coldest places are not found at the edge of the world, but within the human mind.